Hello and welcome back to the Deirdre Camera YouTube channel. This video is going to be part 2 of my Dragon Priest mask making guide, and I just thought before we start I'd do a quick PSA. The previous mask that I was doing in part 1 is actually this one, and you'll notice that it's basically finished. So I ended up carrying on with it and not filming it and finishing it. So what I've done is I've made this one, and I basically got it to the exact same point of the previous video. So don't worry, I ain't gonna miss anything out. We're just gonna carry on from where we left off. It's a different mask, but it's obviously the exact same process. So, next on the list is plastic welding this together. Now, as I said in the last video, this is something you don't have to do. This is purely something I like to do because it adds, you can actually feel like when one's just glued together and when one's plastic welded, it adds a ton of strength to the seams and just makes the prop feel a lot more tough, essentially. You know, I feel like I could, I mean, I won't try it, but I feel like I could probably drop it and not break when I plastic weld these together. And how we're going to do that, and there's 2 ways to do it. You can either use a soldering iron, which we'll come to when it comes to cleaning up the eyes, or you can use one of these. This is called a 3D printing pen. And what this essentially does is it allows you to use old filament, which I have some here, old filament from my 3D printer, and it allows me to add filament to the seams inside the helmets or masks or whatever I 3D print. I pretty much use this technique, and it allows you to basically, you let the pen heat up, you turn it on, and then you run some old filament through it. You can see it. I'll just check the camera. I'm pretty sure you can see that on there. Yeah. So once this runs through here, what you can do is, and I'm really sorry, this camera angle is probably going to be pretty bad, to be fair, but I'm pretty sure you'll get the gist of how it works. Once the filament starts actually running through the nozzle, not yet, hold on. There you go. What you can do is just squish more plastic into all the seams and gaps. Again, I'm sorry for the camera angle, I hope you can see that. It's a little bit messy, but obviously it's on the back. But this is genuinely, if you've used a 3D printer before and you print stuff in parts and you haven't used one of these, you can buy one of these 3D printing pens off Amazon. I can't remember how much they were, but they weren't much at all. I think they're more designed as like a kid's toy. And if I just turn that off, we'll literally see that is how it looks. Just check on the camera that you can actually see that. You've got that side, which is just glued together, and you've got that side, which is all melted in. And when you do this with the whole thing, it adds a massive layer of just extra strength to the print, and you could just tell they just feel more tough. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to cut this video and then we'll come back once I've finished. So I've just finished with the plastic welding, and as you can see in there now, that's all welded together, all the seams. There's a lot more tough. I always do a little bit on here just because it leaves a little bit of a gap, but now you will find there's little bits like this, you can see where it's just sort of left like it's not been done perfectly well. But don't worry, because if you don't have a 3D printing pen but you have a soldering iron, I'm going to show you what I do next, because you can essentially do that same trick, but instead of being able to add plastic, you have to actually melt the plastic on either side together. Now you have to be a little bit more careful with it, because sometimes you can melt too far through, but it's a good way of basically melting this rough 3D print lines that are in the eyes. So with every mask, I go through it all and I just melt it all down a little bit flat and a little bit neater. And then if there's any bits that I missed or that are a little rough or spiky, I just go over it with a soldering iron just to finish that off. So I will do that. And then what I will say is, if you were to buy this, so obviously I sell this file, I sell this raw print on my Etsy store. If you were to buy it on my Etsy store, once I've done this next step, that's essentially what you will get when you buy it. I'll do all this bit for you, and then it'll be the bit after that you'll have to do yourself. But like I say, we'll get the eyes all cleaned up. We'll get the last little bit with the soldering iron nice and cleaned up. Again, none of this stuff you actually have to do, but it just adds a little bit of extra quality to the finished product. So that's why I like to do it. But we'll go downstairs where the soldering iron is, because you probably want to do it outside, and then we'll carry on. So here we have the soldering iron. I'm going to heat this up to around 200 degrees, 210, 200, something like that. That's the same sort of temperature a 3D printer would be running at. And I'm using the flathead nozzle. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to run it over the hard to reach places. So the bit where it's hard to get any sort of sandpaper or sand it down or anything like that. I'm just going to run it over each of these bits and smooth it all out, and it just gets rid of that nasty 3D printed overhang support effect that it leaves behind, and it means that you can have a nice, better looking finish in like the eyes and the mouth. You can also use this on the back to get rid of any rough spots on the back if you're bothered about that. And again, like I was saying before, with that 3D printing pen, any bits where that can't properly get to, you could just melt them together. In fact, I think you'll actually see here the difference between the non-melted parts versus the 3D printing lines. That's the effect that you'll get rid of. But yeah, if you go on the back, just smooth it down on there. And again, if you don't have a 3D printing pen, then don't worry. All you'd have to do on the back is just try and slowly melt together the two seams between the plastic, and you still get that similar sort of effect of the 3D printing pen. It's just, rather than adding plastic, you're just melting the two seams together. Just a quick word as well, I would probably use a respirator on this if you're melting any areas where you've put glue. I know you're outside and things like that, but it's probably worth just wearing one just to save any hassle. But we'll come back once this is done. So here's another optional part. What I'm using here is a Dremel. If you have a Dremel or anything like this, like a little rotary tool, I'd advise getting one of these little pads that you can put sort of 100, 200 grit sandpaper on. And they allow you to just go over the first layer of the mask and just any rough points near the seams or anything like that, or really bad layer lines. It just allows you to give it a once over. As you can see there, it cuts down some of them really rough edges and big layer lines in the mask. Now again, this isn't something you have to do. I'm going to show you what I do for most of the mask, which is actually just wet sanding by hand. But again, if you have one of these tools, you may as well use it to your advantage. Just go over every area with a quick once over, cut down on any big layer lines or imperfections, and then we can get back to the sanding and getting it really nice and smooth. So this is the next stage. And I'll be brutally honest, this is the worst part of the entire thing. So this is the bit that's the most boring, and you've just got to get through it. And that is essentially getting this to go from a 3D printed model to looking nice and smooth and ready for painting. And what you're going to want, I like this stuff, it's a Humbrol model filler. I'll be brutally honest, any filler will be fine. Any like automotive filler or model filler. This is a model filler, but most fillers are pretty similar. This is great for filling in certain areas. So these lines, I use this stuff. The little seam lines and any imperfections, I use this stuff. Now, some people will do this now. We'll actually put this on first. I don't. Now, it makes no difference, I don't think, but what happens is I like this stuff. Now, it's a half-use can. This is Motive Spray Putty. Link in the description below if you're wanting this stuff. It's on Amazon. It's awesome. It's not a primer, so some people say like, oh, it's a filler primer. It's not a primer. I have painted over this stuff and it's been fine, but it isn't a primer. So if you are somebody who's like, I'm going to make sure I prime it before I put any paints on it, you'd have to use this stuff and then you'd put a few coats of primer on at the very end. I will get to that in the painting video, but this stuff is essentially, it fills in a bunch of these layer lines. And what you tend to find, what you're essentially going to do is you're going to put a few coats of that on. It's going to fill in the layer lines a bit. You're then going to sand. So that's going to fill them in. And when you sand, that's going to essentially take away plastic. And when you use that, that's going to fill them in. So it's going to sort of build up the layers like that. And this stuff is awesome. So we are back outside. I've got the Motive Spray Putty here, and I usually do this in 3 coats at a time. A fairly light to medium coat for the first one, and then I hit it with 2 very heavy final coats. And the advantage of a Dragon Priest mask is it doesn't have any small details that you have to be too worried about or scared of filling in by accident. So generally just honestly go to town on this mask a little bit with this stuff. If you get some runs in it, it's not the end of the world. You're going to spend a lot of time sanding. So I'm going to hit this with the 3 coats. Not only does it help fill in the layer lines, it's really good at highlighting any rough spots, any bad layer lines, any imperfections, so you know where you have to spend most of your time sanding. It also shows up any seams and things like that. So once this is done, you can essentially go back to your model filler and fill in the most important parts and the most parts that need the most attention. So you can also see here, look at just how much thicker I'm putting this on. So again, don't be worried about going overboard with this stuff. You're just using it to fill in the layer lines, and there's not any small details that you are probably going to get lost in this paint. So just blather it on, hit it with the 3 coats, and then we'll come back once this is ready. So once your paint's dried, I usually like to give it a good 12 to 24 hours. I'm going to get the model filler out, and I'm going to use any sort of spatula, or in this case I'm using like a lollipop stick. Basically, I'm going to put a bunch of filler down any of the seams or any particularly bad areas. And I'm honestly just going to use the spatula or whatever it is you're using, the lollipop stick, to just push the filler into the areas. This can be quite messy. Just maybe try and not use it too vigorously on any, like, you know, body lines in the mask. But that's how it should look once it's all done. Here we're going to be pulling out our 80 grit sandpaper. I'm going to be wet sanding. You can do this dry. Either's probably fine, but if you find that the paper gets clogged up, then you might want to use wet sandpaper instead. But you can see here, we've got the layer lines going horizontally. You're going to sand against the layer lines. So you're just going to sand, trying to cut down those layer lines in the mask from the 3D printer, sanding against them. There's no point sanding sort of the same direction because it'll just take longer. Sand against them, cut it all down. You might find that after a while, the sanding paper has left layer lines in it, and that's where you just start and sand against that, or using circular motions. But you're just here to just get rid of the main big deep layer lines left by the 3D printer. Finally, just going to use a normal kitchen sponge and a fresh jug of water, and we're just going to give it a quick clean, just so you're not having to bring it back into the house covered in sanding dust and things like that. So we're back with the mask. So we've sanded it down. We've given it a good 2 or 3 coats of spray filler putty. We've filled in some of these with some model filler, and that's what it should look like after your first pass with the low grit sandpaper. So obviously you can see there, it's there's still plenty of layer lines in it, but don't worry. I'm not going to film me just doing it over and over. because you probably don't want to see that. But essentially, I'm just going to repeat that process now. So I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna hit it again with another 2 or 3 coats, probably 3 coats of the filler putty. Once that's dried and settled, read the back of the can, I think it's a couple of hours. I'm also going to redo these with some model filler and any other little bits. Sometimes you have to be careful, like round here, in these like corners, sometimes there's little gaps and things like that. So I'm just going to go over them again with some model filler. We'll get that all filled, and then I'm going to do the exact same again. I'm going to hit it all again with the 80 grit sandpaper, maybe go over some of it with the 240 grit sandpaper. And now we're essentially just going to keep doing that until it's pretty smooth and we're happy with it. Once I've got it to that point, I'll come back and we'll go from there.